So we're going to watch this video from the Duran together. The Duran puzzles me. I'm trying to understand why they see things the way that they do. Now, I'm very much pro-Ukraine. I'm in their corner. I asked myself initially, what would Ronald Reagan do? And when this war broke, and it's clear to my mind that Russia would not be the good guys. The Duran sees things differently, but I'm going to be as fair as I can to what they have to say. But it was like they're recapping this past week, and it seems like we're watching two different weeks. It was really mind-boggling to watch. So let's see what they have to say. Again, I'll be as fair as possible, but I will be reacting and giving a different perspective.
All
So
right,
here we are.
Alexander, let's do an update as to what is going on in Ukraine. Let's start with the front lines, and then we could perhaps talk about Zelensky's disaster trip, because it was bad in the United States, but boy, did it get a whole lot worse in Canada. And we could also mention his stopover in Poland as well, which was very non-eventful. And I think that's worth discussing. All right.
That's interesting. I thought that the trip went pretty well. Yes, there were some kerfuffles. There were some problems with in Washington. He didn't have the same reception that he had before. The comment that he made in the UN led to a greater disruption with Poland, and whoever put this guy in front of the Canadian Parliament should have been fired. Like that wasn't a smart move. The Nazi Ukrainian Canadian, the almost 100-year-old guy, that wasn't smart. But I thought it was a pretty good week for Zelensky. But again, we have very different perspectives, which is why we're watching what we're watching.
So let's start with what's going on the front lines. Has Ukraine liberated Rapotinya for the 32nd time?
I'm glad you put it in this way because I'm now starting to get a real sense of deja vu. And what I mean by that is that back in 2014, when there was the fighting there were all kinds of claims about tremendous Ukrainian advances and captures of places, Rabotino, Verbovoye this year. It was other places. I forget the names now from, 2014. And we were getting maps. There was, the sort of Western maps, which were best based on these claims. And they were getting weirder and weirder and weirder because they showed territory under Ukrainian control, which other reports, and these were Ukrainian and Western reports, showed that they were still contesting. And it seems to me this is exactly what we have now. There were more reports yesterday about more Ukrainian breakthroughs. They're no longer talking about Rabotino, I've noticed. This is no longer a topic that's open to discussion any further. The Russians talk about Rabotino, about fighting that goes on there, but the Western media, the Ukrainians don't. They're now talking about Verbovoye. And yesterday I was reading about how half the village had been captured, how the Ukrainians had broken through the Surovikin line there, about all of these things. And, I started to try and find out where these reports come from. They all come from the Ukrainian General Staff. They're contradicted by other reports from the Russian side. I notice, I don't want to, identify people too obviously, but there are even some Ukrainian channels that are now becoming openly skeptical about these claims. Overall,
Okay, so while we're talking about that, I've read and followed RT while I was reading RT and TASS and Pravda while I'm reading Western press. And I saw the exact same phenomenon about Bakhmut for 6 months. And it took 6 months to take Bakhmut, but Bakhmut's about to fall. Well, a month later, Bakhmut's about to fall. It was the same thing. So,
my sense is that the situation on the front lines is the same as it has been for months now. Total standstill. Wherever Ukraine is trying to advance, they're not able to. They're suffering enormous losses, still trying to advance. A Ukrainian general, General Tarnavsky, has admitted that their advances now, their attacks now, all take place on foot. They no longer try and advance in tanks or infantry fighting vehicle.
And he says he admitted it as if this is a news break or something. Like, hey, he's admitted. No, I mean, we know that that's the case. We know that it's slow going. We know that they had to get out and do this, like, inch by inch through this minefield. So there's nothing surprising here.
Or armored vehicles or anything of that nature. So they attack on foot. They try and run across the minefields, and I want to stress run, because if they advance slowly, the Russians can pick them off. So they have to run across the minefields towards the fortified Russian positions, try and get as close to them as they possibly can before the Russians adjust, and then sometimes there's hand-to-hand fighting. But overall, the story is no breakthrough anywhere. Everything is as it was. Fighting in the same places, the Ukrainians are stuck. That's my assessment of the situation on the front lines.
Okay, so let's shift gears now and talk about Zelensky's trips. We have the U.S. trip, which we've covered, actually, but maybe you may want to talk a little bit about what he did receive from the U.S. and what he didn't receive from the Biden White House. And then we have the trips to Canada. We'll do a more detailed video on Canada because that's quite a big subject to get into on this video, but maybe you want to touch upon his trip to Canada and what he received there. And then we have his return trip through Poland, which I think is a very interesting story that no one is really covering.
I think this is the most disastrous trip that Zelensky has undertaken since he became president, and certainly since the war started. I mean, this was a disaster at every turn. I mean, we've talked...
That's so fascinating because I see it as a net positive trip. So, I mean, we must be looking at two different things. My wife and I do this. We watch the same TV show, and she's seeing the fashion of the person's outfits and paying attention to the love story. And I'm kind of tuning out during that and waiting for the bullets to fly and the bombs to blow up and that kind of thing. So maybe we're just seeing different things, but I think it's more than that. I think that there's nothing good that they will see in Zelensky's trip. Now, I see some problems. I did see some problems in the UN speech, unforced error, smacking at Poland. That guy in Canada that they honored that turned out to be a Nazi. That's a problem. So I see that, but I still think that walking away with $600 million from Canada was a net gain, and commitments of $300 million from the U.S. in the short term and ATACMS will be, and those kind of things are net positives that came out of the trip.
About his speech in New York at the General Assembly. He then went to Washington. He met with Biden. He met with various members of Congress. The whole thing was an exercise in trying to get Congress to authorize funding. It is absolutely clear as crystal that he didn't change a single mind there. He wasn't able to persuade anybody in Congress that they should give him more money. And, we know that there's the people on the Republican Party who are, standing strong. They don't want to authorize funding for Ukraine. They're making this a big issue now. And it's clear that Zelensky coming, far from persuading them to change their minds, it seems, if anything, to have hardened their positions. So, I mean, it was a complete failure as a visit.
So that's interesting. I think he might be onto something. I think he did harden the positions, but on both sides. Those that were pro-Russian already or anti-giving to Ukraine, let's put it like that, didn't change their minds, maybe hardened. But on the other side, those that were pro-Ukrainian, I think also hardened their positions as well. So I don't know that it was necessarily, he's saying it like this huge disaster, but the proof's in the pudding when he walks away with $300 million and then he has promises for ATACMS coming down the pike. And what we'll see in whatever the new appropriations bill is, however, $24 billion that's in the works or whatever it is, the proof will be in the pudding there.
and even the administration, the Biden administration, which wants funding to be authorized by Congress, and by the way, Kirby has now come forward and said that they've only got a few weeks of funds left for Ukraine if Congress doesn't pass any authorization. Even the administration's toned down Zelensky's visit, and we've had this shambles about the attackers. So, one moment they're going to be supplied, next moment there's been no decision made yet. The point is, a decision has been made, but Biden didn't want to announce it while Zelensky was there. And there's two reasons for that. Firstly, because on the one hand, I don't think he wanted to give anything to Zelensky publicly, which would make Zelensky even more confident and even less willing to talk about fighting or negotiating with the Russians, which is what I think Biden, or at least the administration, wants him to do. Jake Sullivan wants him to do. But I think also that Biden and Sullivan and people like him calculated that if there was a big announcement about more weapons to Ukraine, ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, it would go down even worse in Congress and would make any further appropriations, any further funding for Zelensky from Congress even more difficult to obtain. So where he was last...
That's an interesting point. I don't know that that was his calculation. Either of those points, I don't know that was his calculation. It was just a different event than the last time. And somehow we had these expectations that it was going to be like last time, just like the counteroffensive, we had the expectations that it was going to be like Kharkiv. And I don't know that that was ever in the cards, but it could be a third possibility.
Yeah, the hero. He's not the zero. That's putting it too strongly. He's the minus. He's the person.
That's just ridiculous.
That you really don't want in Washington any longer, because he puts people off there, far from encouraging them to support Ukraine in Washington. It deters them from doing so. They don't want to touch this person. And then, of course, he went to Canada.
Okay, so there are some in Congress, a minority in Congress, the Marjorie Taylor Greenes and that ilk, that are put off by him. But there are some that wanted to be around him and want to support Ukraine. And I think that's a majority, a sizable majority. So I don't think that these guys are seeing clearly in that analysis.
Canada. And Canada is the one place you would expect him to get a warm reception. And yes, Trudeau he's a great fan. Canada has a parliamentary system. Trudeau has a majority in the parliament, so he's able to ram.
But he did get a warm reception in Canada. He got standing ovation when he walked in and gave a speech. His experience in Canada was very similar to his experience in the U.S. Congress last time he visited.
Through appropriations, money for Ukraine if he wants to, and he did come up with a big aid package. There's a large electorate, Ukrainian. People from Ukrainian origin who support Ukraine in Canada. So this ought to have been a good visit for Zelensky. And it was a spectacular failure. It was the most embarrassing moment, I think, in his entire political career.
Okay, no, so that's fair. He did have an embarrassing moment, but it wasn't anything that Zelensky did. It was something that somebody else orchestrated, and it wasn't a spectacular failure when you walk away with, what, upwards of $600 million? Of
course, there's been these strenuous efforts to dissociate him from the extreme right in Ukraine. The people have, let's say it straightforwardly, Nazi beliefs that there are, of course, many of in Ukraine, attempts to make out that this is all exaggerated in a Russian talking points.
Well, it is largely exaggerated Russian talking points. That is fair. And to pin Zelensky with what some staffer didn't double check to put this guy, the 100-year-old-ish former Nazi, up because he's Ukrainian and Canadian, for applause, that was boneheaded. But that wasn't Zelensky. And this is going to be, and the Russian media ran with this and ran with this. I understand that the Speaker of the House actually was stepping down for the gaffe, like it was that, so much egg on Canada's face. But it wasn't Zelensky's fault. It had nothing to do with Zelensky. It paints him in a bad light, but it's not something that he did.
What happens? He's there in the Canadian Parliament with someone who actually served in the SS, in the Galicia Division, during the Second World War. An organization, the Galicia Division, which is notorious in Poland, notorious in Israel, notorious amongst Jewish people all over the world, notorious amongst Poles and Russians and every conceivable person.
And no doubt, they're bad guys. I mean, I'm not going to disagree with him that the SS are somehow good. That's just, we're on the same page about that.
And there he was, with Trudeau, with the Speaker of the Parliament. I mean, this was appalling. The imagery of this was absolutely appalling. And so that has spoiled the visit and shattered the impression and reminded everybody of something that they wanted to talk about. They didn't want to talk about, in the West, about this, what at one time, I think it was the New York Times, or was it the New Yorker, said, that Ukraine has this problem, this far right,
Yeah, and so does Russia, and so do many other places. And, he's talking about it. It reminded them of something that they do. No, I think if those that are in the pro-Ukraine camp realize that Zelensky had nothing to do with that, he's not this is not part of what, right? And they're just, okay, yeah, it was a gaffe, it was a discount, and they just leave it alone, right? If you're on the Russian side of this, see how they're connected, and see how they're Nazis and they're Nazis and they're putting the Nazis. I mean, it's just it's kind of laughable to think that that's actually somehow connected, but that's what he's seeing.
Nazi problem. Anyway, they don't want to talk about it anymore, but this brought it, center stage in the most public way. So the Canadian visit was a disaster. And then, as you rightly say, he flew on to Poland. Except nobody wanted.
Now, this is really fascinating to my mind, because I did another one about the Duran a while back, and I got a lot of pushback by people who watched the Duran as, these guys have the best analysis, they're the most insightful, they're always right. And I was thinking, like, they were wrong on a number of points here. I'm not sure how you see that they're right. If you step outside their bubble, you see it differently than if you are just imbibing nothing but the Duran and folks like that, Jackson Hinkle and Scott Ritter and McGregor and these kind of folks.
To speak to him there, nobody from the government wanted to meet with him. The opposition apparently kept clear of him also. He met with some Polish volunteers.
Okay, so now he did talk about the stopover. He's talking about the stopover, Zelensky's stopover in Poland on the way back, and he didn't meet with a prime minister or a president or anybody, and that would have been optimal to kind of clear up what was going on after his. And again, Zelensky's comment about that indirectly talked about Poland in the UN speech was an unforced error. I talked about that. I would agree. But he was coming back through, and this was another stop, and could have been optimized. Sure, was it somehow a huge embarrassment? I don't see it that way.
He clearly wasn't wanted there either. I mean, talk about the cold shoulder. He gets it in Washington. He gets it. We didn't get it exactly in Canada, but it was a disaster for him there. But he gets it on an even bigger level in Poland as well.
Yeah, but they just fixed the problem in Poland. I did a video about that yesterday, about how they're working out their issue between Ukraine and Poland with the grain deal, and they pretty much have it resolved now. So I mean, I don't know why that's a big thing at this point.
As I said, this is a disastrous trip. And the subtotal is, if you put aside the money that he got in Canada, which is going to disappear in a few weeks, it's not remotely, important. It's not a significant amount of money relative to what Ukraine spends all the time. if you're talking about weapons, he got small promises from the White House, and on the ATACMS, it really, as I said, it didn't go particularly well. And of course, the trip overall has to be seen as a terrible failure.
So he calls it a terrible failure. I think it was largely a success, and I think if you're looking at it from the Ukrainian perspective, they walked away with a lot more than what they started with the caveat that that little bit in the UN speech that riled Poland, that was a bad idea. And what happened in the Canadian Parliament, which wasn't Zelensky's fault, also not so great of a look, but I mean, wasn't his fault. So on balance, I would have given him a pretty good score, maybe a B plus, A minus, something in that neighborhood. He's calling it a terrible failure.
Yeah, so I remember when we talked about Zelensky traveling outside of Ukraine, we said that that's not a good idea. We were like, it's probably not a good idea to send them out and about away from his protected green screen environment, because the more people interact with Zelensky, the more they see him, the more they talk to him, the more they listen to him, the more they dislike him. But
I just don't see that. I see that wherever he travels, he gets warm receptions in the West. Now, anyone who's pro-Russian doesn't like him or hates him even more, but and they'll talk about, he's wearing his green suit like he's got a, why can't he wear a tie? Because he's at war. This is martial law. So he's the commander in chief. So I don't know. I mean, I just don't get the way that they see this. I think his traveling has been a net positive, and his role as the president, only he really can be the fundraiser in chief in a meaningful way just because of his role. And he's doing it. He's providing for his people.
The Biden White House, they did not listen to us. They didn't listen to us, and sure enough, we have now the PR media disaster that is Zelensky, and he is dragging down Canada. He's definitely dragged down Trudeau, but he's dragging down Canada, and that's the Zelensky curse for you.
Well, absolutely.
Sooner or later, it gets you. So
I can't fathom how they can see it that way. He's uber popular in Canada. He's largely popular in the United States. Most of the Western nations don't see it the way that Alex is describing it.
I think we were the first channel that talked about that. Keep Zelensky in Ukraine. Don't take him out of Ukraine. But they had to take him out of Ukraine.
Exactly.
Maybe he wanted to leave Ukraine.
Well, of course.
Even the language, they had to take him out, as opposed to that he has agency to decide where he's going to go. It's the Russian narrative of it's the Western masters pulling the puppet strings, and I don't see that.
He clearly does want to leave Ukraine. He wants to keep as far from Ukraine as possible. But, I mean, can I just say
Why?
again, I mean, what happened in Canada feeds back to the US. All these people, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Josh Hawley, they are watching these programs. They know what happened in the Canadian Parliament. They saw it all there.
If Marjorie Taylor Greene and her ilk are getting their information from the Duran, we have a world of problems, because these guys, I mean, they're commentators and they have a right to their opinion. But I don't know that they're seeing clearly or trying to even present like a reality. They're trying to shape a narrative more than present reality, in my estimation. I could be wrong. Maybe that's unfair. And if you think that's unfair, put it in the comments. But I'm trying to understand them as coming from my pro-Ukraine, and I tell you up front, pro-Ukrainian position.
So, of course, and to say also, I mean, I think people in the US, there are a lot of people in the US who do care about what happened in the Second World War. You only
Sure.
have to see the number of histories and books and things that are written about that period in the United States to see this. So, I mean, publicising in all of this in that spectacular way, what happened in the Canadian Parliament, is going to affect feeling in Congress. All right, this is not.
Okay, hold on a second. Of course we care about the Second World War. Second World War was important. The German Nazis were bad. We get that. But that's not the same as what is going on with Ukraine. It's like we're using the same term, but not filling it with the same meaning. When Russians talk about Nazis, they're talking about pretty much anyone who's anti-Russian. They don't mean people who are saying Heil Hitler necessarily. And they're confounding that language. And I think it's an intentional move to blur those lines, to vilify their opponent.
Not a majority of people in Congress, but that the number of people whose doubts have increased is probably significant as a result of that visit.
Honestly, I don't see that at all. Maybe I'm the blind one, but I don't see that at all.
And you remember we were getting all those reports just before that, Zelensky was told to say, well, there were reports that he was going to come and say thank you, and we were saying that he's obviously been told to do that. There was little sign of that whilst he was in the US. Very few thank yous, lots of begging and lots of demands and that kind of thing. But no real sign that he's actually genuinely grateful for anything. He always comes with this colossal sense of entitlement.
And that's another very common Russian talking point in RT, for example. I see that regularly, and I read these daily, that he's entitled, that so his job is to make sure that his people have what they need to defend themselves. And so, yes, he does have to continue to ask and ask and ask and ask. And that goes way back to the Budapest Memorandum when he's giving away, well, not he, but when Ukraine gave away their nukes and they were getting guarantees from the US, the UK, and Russia for the protection of their borders because they're giving away their nuclear weapons. So anybody else not building an army, that's one thing. For them, there's a reason that they didn't have to because they had guarantees. Anyway, let's keep going.
The other thing is, he can't stop wearing that green T-shirt of his. And,
Okay, wait, I'm going to talk about the green T-shirt, but there's another thought that I just had. They were talking about how he's not thankful. He can never say thanks, or he can never, say thank you. I don't know what planet these guys are on. I read every one of Zelensky's speech for the first 5 or 6 months. Every speech, every one of them. He was saying thank you. Thank you to these people. Thank you to those people. Thank you to our partners. Thank you to the EU. Thank you to the United States. Thank you to the paramedics, to the doctors, to whatever. I mean, that was his, go back and read those speeches. And that right there is all the evidence that you need that, yes, he can, and he does, and he regularly does do this. But again, this is their view. They're entitled to their view, but that doesn't mean that their view is correct. I'm telling you, if you want to fact check something as simple as, can Zelensky say thank you? Go to the president of Ukraine's website. It's in English, right? You can find an English version of it and see how many times he says thank you. Okay, let's talk about the green suit because, of course, that's the problem.
Oh, that performance. I mean, by now, you would have thought that someone would have the courage to tell him, put aside the Che Guevara outfit. It doesn't work any longer.
It's not a Che Guevara outfit. This is him in a time of war as the point person, the representative of his nation. If he shows up in a business suit and a tie, it's off note. I mean, it's tone deaf for him to do that.
It might have looked impressive in the first weeks of the war, when you were in Kiev and the Russians were at your door, gave you
it's pronounced Kiev,
an appearance of defiance. But if you're going to come to countries like, address the Canadian Parliament, okay, forget about it. Maybe we won't talk about that. But come to the White House, visit the president, meet Congress people. For heaven's sake, man, put on a tie and suit, look proper. I mean, but either nobody's telling him this or he doesn't get it.
Yeah, and this is the kind of thing that RT will talk about. This is the thing Tucker Carlson will talk about, and it's also meaningless to complain about what he was wearing. It's not like he was being disrespectful. I just felt like I wasn't going to wear much more than a t-shirt, like something I'm wearing. That's different. He's sending a clear, coherent message about what his situation is. And if he was dressing differently, it could actually water down his message.
He doesn't have a good director.
No.
That's simple. He doesn't have a good director.
Yeah.
He's taking direction from someone, and the director is telling him to keep the outfit on.
Okay, and this is why the analysis, I find it fascinating that people are like, oh, the Duran, they're so smart. These guys, they're always right. That's his analysis, that he has a handler that is telling him to wear this and he doesn't have a good one.
And the role has overtaken him.
Yeah.
So, I mean, yeah, he needs the director, whoever's behind the camera. I don't know who it is. Is it Blinken? Is it Sullivan? Is it Newland? Maybe it's all three.
But again, notice the assumption that he has to be handled by the United States, that Zelensky doesn't have agency of his own to make his decisions of even what he's going to wear.
I have no idea, but whoever's directing Zelensky, just a new outfit, please. Wardrobe.
Yes.
Call in wardrobe. Wardrobe. Come in and fix it. And as far as gratitude, he can't display gratitude because he's a spoiled comedian actor. He doesn't understand gratitude. That's not. He doesn't know how to exhibit those emotions. His acting chops. He doesn't have that in his repertoire. That's my.
Again, if you think they're right, go and prove it for yourself. Go to the President of Ukraine website. Just Google President of Ukraine website and read any one of his most recent speeches. I will guarantee you that you'll find lots of gratitude in his most recent speeches. And I mean, you can pick any speech that you want. You'll find it.
That's my thinking on it. But he understands that if he goes around and apologizes, then maybe he's giving ground, and perhaps then he's going to be maneuvered out of office. You have a Washington Post writing that there are many senators and House reps who are ordering him to go through with elections in 2024. His wife gave an interview the other day, and
okay, so elections by law in Ukraine, as I understand it, you can't have elections while you're in a time of martial law. Now, they could change the law, but that's the way that the law reads currently. So I would like him to see, I'm a Westerner, I would like to see elections just so that it takes away the look of something, but that's the way that the law is written.
She said that maybe he won't run in 2024. You have Poland, which came out and with an investigation, the results of the rocket that hit Polish territory. Remember that?
Yeah.
9 months ago, and Zelensky almost started World War III. Well, interestingly enough, Poland has given us the results of that investigation, and they've concluded that the missile rocket that landed in this farm village was indeed from Ukraine.
Yes.
Okay, so that did happen. Zelensky did deny that it was Ukraine that sent a rocket in there, and that's the reason is Ukraine doesn't do that. It was an errant air defense missile. Air defense is trying to shoot down Russian missiles, so what caused that? That's the first part. So I get why he would say, no, that wasn't us, because why would they do that? But it's also Russia because of the air defense. Like, they're trying to prevent Russia's missiles from hitting them. So he wasn't trying to start World War III. He was saying, hey, it wasn't us, it was them. He got it wrong. Just like the marketplace just a couple weeks ago got it wrong. But this is the fog of war. And I'm not like just denying or glossing over anything for him. He can get it wrong. I mean, he's human. That happens.
So you have all of these things now which clearly indicate that no one likes Zelensky. Even his wife is telling him
that no one likes Zelensky? He's more popular than he's ever been.
leave now before they get you. You know, you have all of this going on, and you have Crimea and everything that is happening there, and the Russian retaliation.
Yes.
In Crimea, which has been very significant.
Absolutely.
So what he said about Crimea was, and everything that's happening there, but he didn't talk about anything actually that's happening there, like hitting the Black Sea Fleet headquarters building, blowing up a bunch of officers. He's not going to talk about that. So again, it's part of what the Duran's doing is shaping a particular narrative. If you're watching this and you're pro-Duran, I wish you'd consider thinking about, or if you like the Duran, think about what other news sources you might want to consider that balance the equation rather than just going down that line. Consider subscribing here, because I'm trying to show, and I'm not a neutral party. I'm all in for Ukraine, but I'm trying to show context and show you what's going on.
And the Odessa hotel, it's not looking good for Zelensky. It's not looking good for Ukraine.
Not at any level. Can I just say?
But at what point would they say that it was looking good for Ukraine? And I'm asking a serious question. Like, I don't think that these people are going to continue to say exactly the same thing about how Ukraine's just going to be beaten. I mean, Russia's going to win. It's not looking good. They've been beating that drum for now 500 plus days. Can you imagine that they could have imagined that in week 1 this was going to be going on 500, almost 600 days later? Of course not. Because they couldn't see that. Now, a lot of people couldn't see that, but they were saying, Ukraine's going to be defeated, Ukraine's going to be defeated, Ukraine's going to be defeated. Well, it's like the theory that if you dance long enough, it's going to rain, but anyway.
About this, which is in terms of, I think the elections are actually a big story, because up till this point, up to very recently, the West has been intensely relaxed, to put it mildly, about the fact that Zelensky has shut down newspapers, prevented normal politics from happening in Ukraine.
Yeah, so, it is under martial law, so it's different in martial law than it is the rest of the time.
Suddenly you have this huge push for elections. It looks to me, frankly, as an attempt to leverage Zelensky out, to do it in an orderly way. You hold elections. Either he steps down before the elections take place, or he does contest them and loses, and the West.
Or he could win. I mean, there is that. It's not. They're not even entertaining that as a potential possibility, which I find fascinating.
Preferred candidate, whoever that is, wins the elections and changes the politics, because that's how it looks to me.
Yeah, I agree. I definitely agree with that. They would like an orderly way to get rid of this guy.
Yeah.
But what about, let's talk a bit about the activity in and around the Black Sea, because I think that's also a big deal. We had a video come out from, I don't know if it was the Russian Ministry of Defense that put out this video advertisement, or another group. I'm not sure, but the video hinted at Russia moving towards Odessa, which is interesting because there was another video that came out about a week and a half ago, which hinted at the Russian military moving towards Kiev.
Okay, so notice when they're talking about the Black Sea, they're not talking about the $300 million sub that was just destroyed by a Ukrainian, a British missile fired by Ukraine. They're not talking about the hit on the Black Sea headquarters. They're not talking about their air defense being taken out. They're talking about how Russia is about to take Odessa. What? Russia's going to attack Kyiv. What?
So is Russia signaling something?
Yes, they are clearly signaling something. I think both of those videos, which show reservists, by the way, Russian reservists, and they're talking in the first case about Kiev, and now they're talking about Odessa. I mean, they're clearly indicating that these are now objectives. And we've had this statement from Volodin, who is Russia's Speaker of the Duma, the lower house of the Russian parliament. He's talking about Ukraine has only two options. One is to capitulate, and the second is to be destroyed as a state.
Well, I mean, if the Speaker of the Russian Duma says there's only two options, there must be only two options. No, there's more options than that. Either capitulate or be destroyed. If you could have destroyed them, you would have destroyed them. I mean, short of a thermonuclear missile. And they can't use a nuclear device here without being a pariah for with the rest of the world for a long, long time. So they can't use that. So if they could have done it, they would have.
So that's where we've come to. The Russians are being completely uncompromising, and they're moving towards. It's clear to me that they're moving towards a position of ending the war militarily, and both Kiev and Odessa are going to be objectives of the big Russian offensive that is coming. Now, in the meantime, the Ukrainians, their counteroffensive, as we've discussed, is stuck. They're desperate to get some kind of grain exports going again. And of course, they have to keep the impression that the war is ongoing. So they launch these missile strikes.
All right, I can actually agree with his last 3 points. The counteroffensive is maybe not stuck, but very, very slow. They do want to get grain out, and they do need to give the impression that things are working for them, just like Russia needs to give the impression that things are working for them. And to do that, they don't destroy military. They fire at a hotel somewhere or apartment complex, and then they say that there were all these Ukrainian military there, verifiable or not. They can make things up, but both sides want to give the impression that things are going well for them.
They launch missile strikes against Sevastopol. They hit the Russian Navy headquarters there. They've hit the dock, the repair dock where there was those two ships. They've launched various strikes. And
they are talking about it. I stand corrected. They are mentioning these things. I was wrong, and I stand corrected. They are at least going to have enough integrity to mention these things.
So, the point about these strikes, and I've made this point in my own programs, is that whatever the Ukrainians think they're achieving by them, what they're actually doing is that they're depleting fast a relatively small stock of long-range missiles, which is what they have. Remember, all of the missiles that we've been talking about, the ATACMS, the Taurus missiles they'll soon get from Germany, the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, either they're not being manufactured at all any longer, or in the case of the ATACMS, they're being produced in relatively small quantities to fulfill that existing export orders that the United States has. So these missiles can't.
So this is another common Russian talking point that the Ukraine's going to run out because there's not enough of whatever it is that they're focusing on, as if there's not stocks of other things that they could get a hold of as well eventually. So it's kind of not a fair. It's kind of telling the truth and kind of not telling the truth simultaneously, but it's blurring the distinctions.
Be replaced, and Ukraine is sending large numbers of these missiles at Crimea.
Actually, they're sending very few of those missiles. Meanwhile, Russia is talking to North Korea about getting missiles and talking to Iran about getting more drones. And that's where they're shoring up or sourcing their material. It's not looking good for Russia either.
Trying to create some impression there. What's actually happening is that this targeting Russian targets, hitting Russian targets when they manage to get through, in which I suspect the Russians can absorb relatively easily, but they're expending a disproportionate number of missiles doing it, because for every missile that gets through, they have to launch 6 or 7 that the Russians shoot down. So,
okay, so wouldn't that be fair then to say, and I'm just thinking logically, if they are shooting these missiles through and the Russians have to shoot it down, that the Russians are expending their air defense missiles, shooting them down, and so doesn't that kind of wash out somehow? I'm not sure exactly how that works.
So that's actually the reality of what they're doing. It makes for some spectacular headlines and it gives the Western media something to talk about, but it isn't actually strengthening Ukraine's overall military position. It might even be weakening it because they're running through this.
I don't know. Hitting that sub, I think, was important. Hitting the transport, I think, was important. Hitting the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet, I think that was money well spent on those from the Ukrainian perspective.
Stock of missiles very fast, but it's also doing something else. It's provoking the Russians into a massive counter-reaction. And we've seen this with this enormous drone and missile strike on the various positions, the Ukrainian positions on the Black Sea.
But at some point, the Russians are going to deplete their stocks as well. So if it is provoking them, it's provoking them to deplete their own stocks. And it's not like they're going to be building a whole lot faster than what Western partners are supporting. So I'm not sure I follow the logic.
It's part of this ongoing Russian attempt to smash the grain export infrastructure, which is clearly a major objective for the Russians now. It's also targeting these Western mercenaries who are now clearly a target that the Russians are hunting. But the other thing that the Russians are doing is that they're clearly coming after the locations from which they think some of these missiles are being launched and some of the facilities the Ukrainians are using to continue their attacks on Crimea. So the scale of the Russian counterattacks are much bigger than that of the Ukrainian attacks on Crimea. And at the same time, the Russians, as is now universally admitted, have a major...
So this has been true throughout the war, though. Like, what Russia has been attacking Ukraine with has been larger than what Ukraine's been attacking Russia with. Russia's larger in size, in population, in economy, in like all sorts of ways, and Ukraine has just been getting hit by them, and they're now counter-punching and hitting back. So I don't know what I don't understand his argument exactly.
Production of missiles so that they can continue to produce missiles to replace those they launch. Ukraine cannot do that. So it's not...
Okay, so they're saying that Russia can produce more missiles, but Russia's actually hamstrung in certain ways. They can't get some of the component parts to produce some of the missiles. They can produce lots of dumb munitions, but producing the kinds of targeted munitions that they are trying to replace is going to be very, very hard with sanctions.
Good strategy. It's actually a strategy which, for a time, will get Ukraine a lot of publicity in the West, but which has only a finite point and which is squandering assets, these missiles that Ukraine might be intending to use in a more could be using in a more effective way further on when the Russian offensive starts.
Yeah, I don't think these strikes, like in Sevastopol, are really gaining much traction either.
No.
To be quite honest, they're in the headlines maybe for a day and then they just drop out.
Yes.
Okay, so it's not just about the political victory, though. I mean, they've actually struck intelligent targets. They're not striking a hotel somewhere. They're striking the headquarters of the Black Sea Fleet. They're striking a ship or the Crimean Bridge or things that make sense. So I just don't see it the same way that these guys do. I can't. I'm honestly baffled that people think that these guys are great analysis. It's very surprising to me, and I'm trying to be kind to them. I'm not saying, well, they're jerks. I'm not doing that. I don't see things the way that they see it, and it's really odd to me.
I mean, we've had too much of this.
You can understand that it's not, even their PR's not working.
No, it's not working because it's so it seems so insignificant compared to what we were being promised a few months ago. By this point, it wasn't. They weren't going to be launching missiles against the.
And that's fair. We did think that the counteroffensive was going to be more robust, but it was more difficult. Like 6 months of delay caused a very difficult counteroffensive.
Against Crimea, when 6 out of 7 missiles get shot down, and they do a certain amount of damage, but objectively not very much. What we were promised a few months ago was that the Ukrainians would be on the Black Sea and they'd be shelling Crimea around the clock. So
That's a little overstatement in trying to prove his point. So that's not really fair. That's more of a straw man than anything else.
It looks pale in comparison with what they were talking about just a few months ago. And to reiterate again, the thing that the Western governments were really interested in, which is the progress in the offensive. That offensive has effectively come to a stop. And Zelensky coming to Western capitals and behaving in this extremely arrogant and entitled way isn't helping either.
Again, these are assertions that he's making based on his assumptions that that's how he is, that I don't know that people who are more amenable to Zelensky feel.
Yeah. He needs to capitulate.
No.
That's not what's going to happen. They're going to maneuver him out.
They're going to maneuver him out. I agree. I mean, we are looking at regime change in Kiev. We've talked about it many times.
I don't see that. In fact, if I was a betting man, I'd be willing to put up about any amount of money that that's not going to happen. I could be wrong, but I just don't see it.
People have talked about coups and assassinations and all that kind of thing. By the West, it's the West that is demanding these elections. That's important to understand. It's not the Russians either, obviously. The Russians, I think they're past caring any longer.
Russians, because they're going to have elections that are corrupt and meaningless. I did a whole video about their recent elections and how inflated the elections were in those 4 oblasts as opposed to where they were in the rest of Russia. Go back like a week or so and you'll see that. They had about 40% turnout rate in the rest of Russia, but 60+% turnout rate in those 4 oblasts. Really? And that wasn't corrupt. And it turns out United Russia was winning everywhere. How about that?
What happens in Kiev? They don't have any expectations of these elections because they know that the purpose of these elections is to replace Zelensky with somebody who'll follow orders from Washington. So that's not something that...
So that assumption is just so pervasive on pro-Russian channels that it's just that Zelensky's just a puppet being directed by his Western masters.
Russians are interested in or care about at all. I mean, Volodin has now set out what the objectives are. Either Ukraine capitulates and accepts all Russian demands, which would mean that the Ukraine we have known and which Zelensky is defending and which the West is supporting ceases to exist, or Ukraine ceases to exist completely as a state. That's...
Okay, so he's going to say that's it, but I think Ukraine's going to go for option number 3. All right, we have less than a minute here of their ranting, and let's see what they have to say.
That's the alternative that the Russians are giving, and the defense ministry is now dropping very heavy hints that, once this offensive is over, this Ukrainian offensive is over, when the very much bigger and far more powerful Russian offensive happens, Odessa and Kiev are both objectives.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. I can't imagine that that's actually going to happen, but we'll see how this plays out. Maybe there are prophets. I don't think so, though. I think that they've been saying the same kind of thing for the last year, and every time I check in, it's about the same story. And I just don't understand how... tell me what I'm missing. If you're pro Duran, I'd love to hear from you, why you think these guys are actually telling you the truth as opposed to spinning a particular narrative that happens to be the same narrative you'll see in RT and TASS and Pravda. Because I just don't get it. All right. Thank you for your time. Thank you for the likes, the shares, the subscribes. If you're looking for equal time, if you are pro Duran and you want to see the other side because you want to be intellectually honest, please consider subscribing. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.